So last week, I know Pastor Brad gave an introduction talking about what it meant to be a healthy church or a corporate body, applying it obviously to us here as we were talking about the church at Thessalonica. The church at Thessalonica is interesting because in many ways it reminded me, I was just reviewing some things, it reminded me a lot of who we are here in Charleston. Charleston is a seaport city. It's a city with a harbor. It's a city with ports. It's a city that has a reputation for being, I will say religious because of the skyline of steeples. We're called the Holy City. Most of you know or should know there's only 3 cities in the world that are called the Holy City. Jerusalem, the Vatican, and Charleston, South Carolina. There you go. There's just 3 of us, and we're in that group. And in much the same way, though, as much as, I love and can appreciate Charleston, some of you are longtime residents, maybe you're original Charlestonians as well. But in many ways, Charleston is like Thessalonica. Thessalonica was on the port. It had a seaport economy. They weren't short on religion either. In fact, there were many religious expressions that had sprung up. Both pagan as well as Jews had landed there in Thessalonica. And then along comes Paul. A church arises in Thessalonica, and along comes Paul. And so he begins to minister and work within the city of Thessalonica, especially with the church that was arising there. And lo and behold, guess what Paul does? He aggravates everybody. Paul didn't come in wanting to ingratiate himself with everybody, but he begins to aggravate people. How can you aggravate people? Come on, how would an outsider come in and aggravate people? I can tell you how you do it. Do you want to know how you can aggravate people quickly? Tell them they're wrong, that's good. Or tell them Jesus is Lord. Because the instant you say Jesus is Lord is the instant you challenge their idols. You challenge the power of the state. You challenge their personal autonomy. Everybody has a Lord. Everybody has an idol. And when you find out that you're not it, and the state's not it, and your idol's not it, it can cause aggravation. And that's exactly what happened in Thessalonica. And so Paul begins to work there. He only stays really a short time at Thessalonica, and then he continues his global assignment, but he begins to write back and maintains his connection with this group of people at Thessalonica. Now, I just want to suggest to you that when you look at the New Testament and when you look at the American church, and I'm not wanting to be too hard on the American church, but I just want to make some points here, that the American church has a way of doing spirituality that is not necessarily analogous to the way they did it in the New Testament. I hope you realize that. A lot of the things we do by way of tradition. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying it's not exactly like they did it in the New Testament. And what happens is that out of that American template, we begin to cement ourselves into thoughts and ideas that oftentimes box us in to what the Lord may want to do in our life. And not only that, it may cement us into some things that cause us to lose our credibility. Because here's the deal. The early church was living in a far more adverse environment than we're currently living in, as adverse as it's becoming here in America. But they had an ability to engage it, to effectively evangelize it, and to find kingdom success in the midst of it, despite all the adversity that was swirling around it. I just want to suggest to you that the American church is going to have to get back to a biblical template. The American church is going to have to renew its mind, even though it doesn't think it needs to renew its mind. It needs to renew its mind to the Scriptures, to what God has said in His living book. And if we don't begin to do this, we're going to find ourselves in an increasingly more challenging position as Christians who live in America. I mean, again, I'm just saying what we already know. If the church was all that in a bag of chips, we wouldn't be having presidents that issue mandates that girls can go to boys' bathrooms and boys can shower in girls' showers. There'd be no way. The church would simply say, nope, isn't going to happen, and no one would even dare. There'd be power. I mean, can you imagine? In the early church, you couldn't just, if you just chose not to tithe, you die. Can you imagine all the rest? But here we are. And I just want to say for just a moment that you know me, I'm pretty vocal on social media with cultural issues. And I always want to be biblical from the pulpit, and anybody that knows me knows, really, if you hang around me, and if you hang around Legacy very long, you'll find out that I don't spend an inordinate amount of time talking about what we would define as political issues. I really don't. I do have a lot to say about it at times on social media, so if you follow me in social media, like on Facebook or Twitter or something like that, yeah, I probably do talk about it a lot there. But when you come to church, if you would look at all the messages that I preached out there, you'll find that I don't spend an inordinate time on this subject. But this morning I want to spend just about 60 seconds and just share something with you that I know most of you already know this, and it's this: that the executive order that our president has issued through the Department of Education to the public schools, that they're to make bathrooms open to transgendered individuals, which, by the way, there's great misrepresentation, and there is great scientific evidence that when you're talking about a transgendered issue, you're not talking about somebody that was just internally wired wrong. We're talking about someone that has very, very real psychological issues. Yeah. And to suddenly foist upon our children, especially within a public school, that boys can now go into that girl's restrooms or vice versa, I am here to tell you that it is time that pastors and the church stand up and say, no way. No way. I'm here to tell you that I just read recently where the president of the American Family Association sat down with the CEO of Target. There are over like 1.5 million people who have signed the Boycott Target website. Target has lost somewhere in the neighborhood of, they're saying now, $5 billion on the stock market. I think so too. I mean, the way of the transgressor, the scripture says, the way of the transgressor is hard. And if you transgress what God has said, there is repercussion to it at the smallest levels and even at the greatest corporation levels. And America needs to realize this too. If you transgress what God has said, then you will find your way hard. But the AFA president sat down with the Target CEO, and they were talking about how the boycott could potentially be released or stopped. And the CEO of Target decided to double down and basically said that Target would continue to open up their department store restrooms to people that no matter which way they happen to feel, if you walk in that day, and I guess if you're a guy and you feel like you're a girl, you can go in the women's restroom. There is no precision to this. There is no ability to codify a feeling. Whatever someone identifies with, they get to go to that particular restroom. And I'm just here to say that we'll probably go to the bathroom before we go shopping anymore. I know however this goes, but I'm guaranteeing you this, just like you've seen other people say, that if my daughter goes into a restroom and there's a guy that goes in there, I'm just telling you, that's not going to be good. And that is not a reflection of my Christianity, it is a reflection of my righteousness and godliness. What I meant was if I go in there and we have a little altercation. I don't want that. Nobody's asking for this. Nobody wants our children to be jeopardized when they go off to school. America is in that free fall morally. I didn't sign up for this time. If I could have chose a time to be born in, I think I'd have chose about 1940. If I would have had a choice. I probably wouldn't have liked it then either, but I'm just saying if I had my choice, looking back. I didn't choose to be alive in 2016. I didn't sign up to have to face all that's going on in our culture right now. I didn't ask for all this to take place, but hear me when I say this. You and I have come to this nation at this time for such a time as this. That's us. It's us. Listen, God must have knew something, thought something, saw something in you and me that said, all right, I'm going to put them in 2016, because really if they got in touch with me and they walked with me and they got filled with the Spirit by me, I can do something with them even though it'll be the craziest time they've ever seen. So all I want to do is to live up what apparently he feels like he can trust me with. But we as a nation are in a moral free fall. And a part of the reason is due to the fact that the church has lost its spiritual and moral credibility. We have no clout anymore with the Almighty and no clout with the culture. Now, I'm talking in a macro sense. I understand many of you are loving God, walking with God. You're doing everything you know to be good, right, and upright. You're praying. You're doing everything you know, and the Lord's smiling on you. I get it. As an individual, you may be doing everything you can do, and favor is upon you. I am saying, though, at large, the church has lost its clout with the Almighty. Otherwise, our nation wouldn't be spiraling out of control. And because we've lost our clout with the Almighty, we have no clout with the culture. And so I think it providential that the chapter we're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, as well as the fact on the church calendar it's Pentecost Sunday, that we're at the same crossroads that the early church was facing with regards to where the culture was and what God wanted to do. And it is time that churches became upper rooms again. And that we cried out to God, we became desperate for God, we sought Him for revival. And hear me when I say this, that revival and reformation are two sides of the same coin. You really can't reform culture unless revival comes. It's really hard. I don't know if you've noticed, it's hard to disciple unsaved people. Have you ever tried to disciple? It's hard enough to disciple people who say they're saved. I've tried to disciple people who say they're saved. Just try to get a saved person to just memorize a portion of Scripture, and you think you are asking them to do brain surgery or something. Just someone who says they're saved, to get them to get to church on time. A saved person, just to get them to practice some spiritual disciplines. A saved person, just try to disciple a saved person. Well, maybe people are saved and they aren't really saved. Have you ever thought about that? As hard as it is to disciple those who say they're saved, can you imagine trying to disciple a nation that doesn't want anything to do with God? Well, that's next to impossible. That's why reformation will always be challenging unless revival comes. Doesn't mean you ignore it. It just means when revival comes, it becomes a whole lot easier. Because you read the stories of revival and you'll soon find out very quickly that when the Spirit of God moves and people are truly converted, it's amazing what begins to take place in culture. Just read accounts of the New Hebrides revival and how when God blew through those islands there in the United Kingdom, how all of a sudden the whole culture shifted from being unrighteous and ungodly to suddenly being godly and righteous. It's amazing. It's what happens when the Spirit of God blows. But here's the deal. The deal is, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, is that Paul was beginning to talk to the church who was living in a very adverse climate. He was beginning to talk to them about how they needed to demonstrate a credibility to the culture. In fact, I love the first few chapters because the first few chapters really revolve around the concept of credibility. He starts out in chapter 1 talking about being a healthy church, what it means to be a healthy church. And then in chapter 2, he begins to segue into this instruction and exhortation as to whether or not their life will be credible. And so that's what we're going to talk for just a few moments this morning on what I've entitled out of chapter 2, the question, is my life credible? Just think that question for a minute. Is my life credible? Now, I know most of the time whenever Pastor Baird does a message, usually he reads a text, but I'm not going to read a text at this particular moment. But I'm going to begin to walk through just some points that Paul begins to make here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. And so we're going to be reading a lot of Bible. Is it okay if we read the Bible in church? Come on now. I hope you brought your Bible or some technology with you so you can follow along. I know there's little books in every pew that you can take notes. It might be good to take some notes, because more than anything, we need to be credible people. And so we're wanting to read some scripture and do this. Now, there's a phrase that at times is used to describe a person or their character, especially when their credibility is in question. We call it having a credibility gap. Have you ever heard that phrase? And what we mean by that is there's something missing between what they say and how they live, what they advocate and what they practice. Let's say a person is an advocate for fiscal responsibility. In other words, they say, we need to be fiscally responsible. And maybe we would agree, but yet they filed 5 bankruptcies. How many of you know there's a credibility gap? Or somebody, I remember on one occasion there was a politician who was sitting in my office, and he had gone through a rather significant moral failure and running for office again, soliciting my endorsement, I would suppose, or my support at some level. And he wanted to be able to say that he supported everything that I and our community support. In other words, he wanted to support family values. And I remember looking at him and saying, well, you left your wife and you left your kids. It was all well documented and splashed out there in all sorts of media outlets. How do you not know that if you were to run on a platform of family values with what you have actually done with your life, there would be a great credibility gap? That's what that word means. A credibility gap occurs when you confess one thing, but you're not living or implementing it in your own life. Now, the sad observation in our time period is that the church, unfortunately, has a credibility gap on some levels. The credibility gap is one of the reasons, I believe, why culture doesn't listen to us as a faith group. They don't see any credibility. What they see are people who are as crazy and dysfunctional and immoral and lack power as they are. And I know but what we do is we paste the bumper sticker on that says, not perfect, just forgiven. But now we have presidential candidates who say they don't even need that. And so we can stand up and say, they can hold their Bible and say, I'm a Bible-believing Christian. And at the same time say, I don't need to be forgiven. I can live the way everyone else lives. I can say anything I want out of my mouth. We can toss our Bible around and say, I'm a good Christian. And the world looks at us and goes, are you kidding me? Even the world knows that can't be. There's a credibility gap. Now, it'd be great if you could gather up every Christian in America and somehow you could pipe in a message to each one, and that isn't going to happen. So, those of you that have gathered here at Legacy this afternoon, all I can do is pipe it into you. And maybe a few that might check me out on Periscope or YouTube or something like that. But we have to do our best that when the eyes get turned to us, they see credibility. So I want to just share with you in these verses, and again, we're going to do this relatively quickly this afternoon, as to how Paul presented his credibility. And I want to read to you through this second chapter and just go through a little outline that you can write down, and I want you to hear what I'm saying and begin to apply it. In other words, begin to embrace it and apply it to your own life. All right, how Paul presented his credibility. How did Paul present his credibility? Well, let's look at this, because the first thing he said was Paul was persecuted. Paul the persecuted. Here's what it says in these first 3 verses. We're reading through chapter 2. It says, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit." Paul the persecuted. This is what Paul says. Paul says that you know when I began to speak to you, you know my story, and that persecution was a part of my story. Now hear me when I say this. Persecution purifies our motives. That's a good Twitter point. I'm helping you tweet this afternoon. Persecution purifies our motives. What do I mean by that? It's this. Nobody wants to be persecuted. Nobody wants to live in adversity. But the truth of the matter is that when a person is persecuted for their faith, it reveals their motives. No one is going to take the heat for long for a lie. Right? If you're going to get beat up, you're going to get beat up over a lie? Probably not. All of the original 12 apostles were in some way persecuted for their faith. That is why the credibility of the testimony of those apostles remains with us to this day. Who is going to allow themselves to be killed for a lie? Well, no one would. It's just not human nature to do that. Hear me when I say this. Why is God allowing sifting to come to the church? Why is God allowing persecution and adversity to come to the Church of America? It's because He is going to sift out motives. If you're here because Jesus is simply the guy in the sky who wants to give you whatever your heart's desire is and just laden you with stuff and money and career, and all Jesus is the big blesser in the sky. And let me tell you, we preach the blessing of God. But hear me when I say this. A lot of people serve Jesus for what they can get, not because of who He is. And so God lets persecution come to us. Why? It'll sift your motives out. Why are you here? Well, I'm here because I want God to do A, B, C, and D. You need to be here because you were dead in trespass and sin, and your only response is to worship Him. Suffering is for the express purpose of revealing the heart. You ever notice that whatever's inside of you will always come out the minute you're suffering? Every doubt, every question, every attitude, every latent thought, you just get under a little heat. Just put a little heat on a person and you'll find out what's inside of them. You just cook it, you just put them in a cooker, and that thing starts cooking and they'll just bubble up and you'll get to see, oh, that was inside. Here's the key. Will you see what's inside? Suffering authenticates the message. There's something authoritative about a person who's carrying a few scars on their body. I've met pastors from various countries and global areas who've been in jail for their faith. You want to know who the hero is? It's not the guy that has the television ministry. It's not the Christian celebrity. It's the pastor who stood for Christ and they threw him in prison in some Siberian gulag that no one even knows about. You don't even know his name, but he went to prison. Or there he was in China and he went to prison. And at that moment, he became a celebrity in the eyes of God. It's the pastor who stood for Christ in the face of Caesar. That's the real hero. Just last week, I ran into a lady by the name of Eva Edel. You may never have heard of Eva, but Eva is in her mid-80s. She's a concentration camp survivor. You may not know much about the concentration camps of World War II, but whatever you can think horrifically being done from one human being to another, it pretty much happened in a concentration camp. She was raped untold numbers of times. She actually went to 2 different concentration camps. The first one was terrible, she said. The second one was a little bit better because of the 2 guards she interacted with. Only one of them raped her. Can you imagine measuring the quality of your life in terms of, well, only 50% of the guards raped me? She lived in filth. She told stories of eating food that was roach infested. And yet she talked about the power of God and the ability to find your joy and His peace and strength. And listening to her talk, I just thought to myself, how many of us could have gone through a life like she has gone through, the incredible evils that were perpetrated upon her, and yet she speaks with joy and she speaks with this credibility. Why is that? Her suffering authenticates her message. That's what God is doing to the American church. The American church doesn't have a voice anymore. It used to have a voice. We don't have a voice anymore, so God's going to fix that. He's going to allow suffering to come to us in order that we can authenticate the message. I understand it's not a head-turning, heel-kicking, shout the pastor down, because who wants that? Nobody wants it. I don't want it. I don't want my kids to face it. If I could eject from it, I would. But here's the fact of the matter. If we won't turn to God because of His blessing, then we will turn to God because of our pain. Yes, sir, we will. Paul the persecuted, that brought about credibility again. Anytime you're under adversity, say to yourself this. If you're under adversity, just say this. Just say, I'm being authenticated right now. I'm getting a stamp of approval right now. My credibility rating is increasing. I'll be honest, I want to see someone with some stripes on him. I like a guy that has a few faith scars on his body. There's something about that just speaks to me. Paul the persecuted. Number 2 was this, Paul the pattern. What gives you credibility? How he presented his credibility was the pattern. Verse 4 says this, but as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness, God is witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. Paul was looking at the Thessalonians and he was saying this. He was saying, we came to you and we manifested the pattern of what an apostle should really be like. We didn't manipulate you, we didn't twist you, we didn't coerce you, we didn't leverage you, but we came to you in a genuine fashion. God knows us, he says, and we became a pattern even to demonstrate what it meant to follow Christ. Now, hear me when I say this. A Christian can never say, I don't want to be a role model. That is not an option. I'll put it to you like this. I have good news and I have bad news. I have good news and I have bad news. People are watching you. That's good news, and that's bad news. Some are watching you for your failure. They want to see you fall. They want to seize it in order that they could either use it against you or to justify their own life for some reason. Some are watching you because they want you to succeed. They want to emulate you. They want you to be that person they can look up to. The bottom line is you're being watched closely by somebody. Nobody here in the room, don't you come up to me and say, nobody's watching me, because I'm here to tell you that's not true. Somebody's watching you. You're probably being watched by more people than you can even imagine. And hear me when I say this, if everybody is important, you'll hear people say that. Well, you know, everybody's important and He's all for one soul. And if everybody's important, then that one person who's watching you is important. So it's important for you to live in such a way that you don't cause them to stumble. I know that you and I, most of us here, we don't think we're all that much in our own eyes. And I guess that's a good thing. We don't want to be wise in our own eyes or make more of ourselves in our own eyes. But hear me when I say this, and I'm not saying it in any arrogant or any unrighteous way. People are watching you. They are watching you. My in-laws and my parents have watched our lives for 35 plus years. 35 years. Some people will watch your life for decades before it starts to work on them. That's why you've got to live this thing. You've got to seek God. You've got to cry out to God. He's got to empower you to live this thing because they're watching you. Ask yourself a question. If people patterned their spiritual life and journey off of yours, would that be a good thing or a bad thing? If they just looked at you and just said, I'll tell you what, I'm going to be a Christian and I'm going to do it just like you do it. Is that good? Or would that be bad? It's interesting because Paul said in another letter, he said these words. He said, follow me as I follow Christ. You think that'd be pressure? He was saying, if you don't get it, or if you can't understand it, or if you don't know exactly how to apply it, then here's the deal. Come on and just follow me. Follow me as I follow Christ. I can get you there, just follow me. Can you imagine that? Could you say that to someone? Looking at someone saying, hey, I tell you what, follow me as I follow Christ. I want you to get this, and if you're having a hard time getting it, just follow me. I remember years ago I was teaching at this point, and people were upset with me because they thought I was teaching that you were to follow a man. Now here, let me just say it out loud right now. I know that I'm not Jesus. Isn't that revelation? And I'll just say this, you aren't either. None of us are. But the deal is, we're not saying for you to follow a man and not follow Jesus. We're telling you that if you need that kind of help, follow a man who is following Jesus. Follow me, imitate me. I can get you going in the right direction. That's the pattern. Our lives are a pattern. That gives us credibility when people's eyes come upon us. Number 3 is this. It's Paul the parent. Paul the parent. Let me read to you a couple verses, 7 and 8, and then I'm going to leap over to 11 and 12. It's interesting because he uses both the analogy of a mom and a dad. Listen, he says, "But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us." Now leap over to verse 11. It says, "As you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory." So, Paul says, here's the credibility, and this is how he presented it. He said, I came to you as a parent, and there's a mother aspect, and there's a father aspect. Now, I don't know about you, but usually in roles in the house, in a family, between a mother and a father, there are distinguishing. Now, I'm giving you kind of general kind of roles here. I understand sometimes it works out a little different, but the mothers tend to be the nurturers. It seems to me, just from my observation, that women generally, moms in particular, seem to be better at the relational side of things. I mean, I'm generalizing, but moms seem to be the ones that if the children fall down, they'll pick up their kids and they'll kiss their boo-boos, and they'll brush them off, and they'll want to hug them, and they'll make it all right. Now, if the child falls and dad's there, he just says, "Get up, shake it off, you'll live." That's kind of how it works, isn't it? I don't know if that works that way in your house, Robert, but that's kind of how we work in our house. Mom's going, "Oh, let me kiss your boo-boo. Doesn't it feel better?" And dad's going, "Don't kiss the boo-boo. Just let them get up and get on with life. Life's full of boo-boos." That's kind of the difference between a mom, isn't it, and a dad. So you kind of know what I'm saying. Mom, moms can be a rescuer at times. Some moms are rescuers. It's like when the kids get in trouble and they know that dad is going to go crazy, and mom's going to kind of rescue them. And so mom will intervene, and she'll be maybe even a little more patient. It's interesting how patient moms can be with kids. If you give a dad his child for a little bit, it's going to be like in about 10 minutes his patience will run out. But moms, they're stay-at-home moms that they'll go weeks and just be patient with that. I always think there are wonderfully patient women, I'm sure. I think of Sherry, though. Sherry just has that disposition. Is she patient at home like that? With the kids. Oh. Not with you, though, is she? Oh, why doesn't that surprise me? I don't know. But the point I'm trying to make is that, they're patient, but it's dad, like his dad go, "Life is hard. It's survival of the fittest. Come on. I remember when the boys played sports. And it was mostly football. They played Pop Warner football. And we'd be in the stands and watching the kids. Now, when they're real little and they're playing football, this is a dad talking. It took me forever, really, to talk my wife, Trace, into letting the boys play football. She didn't want the boys to play football. They'll get hurt. And I used to say, "Listen, man, when they're only 7 years old, they aren't strong enough, and they cannot generate enough speed to hurt each other. That you just put them in these football clothes, and they just bump into each other. That's all they do. It's just a bunch of bodies bumping into each other. They don't get hurt." So finally, she relented and let the boys do that. And I'll never forget standing up, watching the boys play football. There'd be some, they all mingle, and somebody's on the ground. And if it was one of ours, "Oh, is he hurt?" Is he hurt? And it's like, sit down. You don't have to run on the field or, And of course, for me, it's like, you're not hurt. Get up. Hit him harder next time. That's the difference between a mom. Hear me. I'm belaboring this point for a purpose. I'm going to get there. Paul said this, there are at times, it's true, you need somebody to nurture you, to tell you it's going to be okay, to watch over you, to dote over you, maybe even to rescue you. There's nothing wrong. And he said, there were moments I came to you, even out of that spirit of a mother that just was nurturing. But he also said this, there are times that you got to look at people and you got to say, get up, get over it, and get going. Get up. You're not that hurt. That's what the Hebrew writer said one time. He said, you've not resisted to the point of shedding blood. How would you like that for encouragement? He's saying, you're not bleeding yet. The minute you start bleeding, we'll start talking about compassion. Up to now, no compassion. Nobody's bleeding, no compassion. And he said there's some credibility, and there's some credibility as a believer in that, because all believers like the mama kiss the boo-boo. Oh, did you sin? Oh, let me kiss your sin, boo-boo. Oh, I'm so sorry. It'll get better. And dad's going, quit that stuff. You're going to kill yourself. Are you following me? And the fact of the matter is, if all you have in your life is mama kissing your boo-boos, you're not going to grow up right. That's why you need a mom and a dad. This isn't really rocket science, you would think. Of course, in our current culture, apparently it is. Number 4, Paul the principled. Paul the principled. He says this in verse 9, for you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preach to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believed. I like that last phrase, how devoutly, justly, and blamelessly we behaved ourselves. Paul was principled. Here's credibility. Listen to me. It's this. Is there any principle or conviction that you would lay your life down for? What is a non-negotiable? What principle is there for which you would never recant? Is there any line that you would refuse to cross for any reason? Most of you know that I am spending a lot of my energy these days engaging the culture, and a lot of times it finds me in the political arena. It is interesting to me that Christian people who are our government officials will violate their faith in a heartbeat if it helps the economy. If it's about money. They will turn their back on everything that God has said if it has anything to do with the economy. I was with a guy in Indiana, and this is what he said to me. He said that the reason they're going through this whole thing, this whole LGBT movement, the whole transgendered bathroom movement, the whole reason they're doing this, in fact, he looked at me and he said, you don't get it. When you have major corporations and companies that say they're going to leave your state and take all their money with them if you don't do this. You don't understand the pressure, he said to me, that we go through, that they're going to reduce the bond ratings that you have within your state. From a AAA, they're going to take it down to an A rating. He said, you don't get it. And I said, I get it. What's happening here is this, that you've got a principle that dollars will buy. That's the bottom line to this. You really don't believe that it's God who exalts a nation. You really don't believe that obedience to God will cause His provision and prosperity to come. You don't believe that. You believe that capitulating to whatever aberration there is in the world, that is what is going to help the state. That's what you believe. I just found your line. And your line is this, that as long as money is involved, anything is on the table of negotiation. Even pastors do it. Pastors will trim their message because they're afraid somebody who's tithing might not like what they say. And they'll take their money and they'll go somewhere else. And there's got to come a day in America that the pulpits come aflame again. And they look at the people and say, I want you to be obedient. I want you to be here. I'm not trying to alienate you. But truth is not tied to your tithe. Go take your tithe that you think God's blessing you with, that you won't have any blessing because your ears aren't open to hear any truth. I understand, but this is where we're at in America. And I know people look at me. I've had guys pull me out, pastors, you'll never grow a church that way. I'm not trying to grow a church. I'm trying to obey God. You'd like to think the two could go hand in hand. I wonder now in America, we've lost our credibility. And then finally, number 5 is Paul the polarizer. We're going to end here with this. It says, for you, brethren, became imitators of the churches of God which are in Judea in Christ Jesus. For you also suffered the same things from your own countrymen, just as they did from the Judeans, who killed both the Lord Jesus and their own prophets, and have persecuted us. And they do not please God and are contrary to all men, forbidding us to speak to the Gentiles, that they may be saved, so as always to fill up their measure of their sins, but wrath has come upon them to the uttermost. What Paul is saying is this. He's saying, I came, I preached, and all of a sudden everybody polarized. They didn't want, the very people who said they loved God didn't want to hear the prophets. Are you following me? The people who said they loved the Lord did not want to hear the prophets of God. They ran Paul out of town. They did all kinds of things. They eventually killed the very Son of God himself. Paul was a polarizer. Let me tell you where credibility comes. And this is a challenging point, which I really hate, but if you're listening and you really have ears to hear, you got to make peace with this thought. Make peace with this thought. That if I run with the Lord wholeheartedly, it's going to polarize people. Some will like me, some will hate me. Now, in my mind, I say, how could you hate this? But you understand, it's not just hating you, it's hating the message that's in you. We all know people that we might say of them, you either love them or hate them. There's no middle ground. I'm not advocating that we ought to try to alienate people. I don't think we should try to be alienating. I think there are lots of things we can do to be winsome and gracious and what they use the term loving and extending and whatever word you want to use. But hear me when I say this. We can do our best to be reconcilers and lovers of all people, but we just can't forget that our faith is based on an exclusive truth, and that is Jesus is the only way. He's the only way. And that polarizes people. How can you say He's the only way? You're going to say all these other people are bad people? No, well, I'm not going to let anybody put words in my mouth, but I'm here to tell you He is the only way. It's a part of the package of genuine credibility. When you say that allegiance to Jesus Christ is exclusive and there can be no other, and your highest loyalty is to Him, I will assure you it polarizes the room at that very moment. I'll end with this. The world and your circle of influence is desperately wanting to seek credibility. But here's where it starts. We've got to be credible with the Almighty first. And as we become credible with Him, then we can become the real deal with everyone else. I want to tell you one last story. Dr. Ron told me this story the other day. There's a neighbor of his, a parent who was having a child that was having a difficult time. And eventually the law caught up with the child, and it happened to be a girl, and she was arrested and taken to court. And they asked if Pastor Marion Ron's wife would come to the courtroom. And so she said she would. And so she came to the courtroom. And at first, nobody wanted Pastor Marion in the court. They just said, stay out here. And she just said, I understand. I'm just here to support family and a neighbor and a friend. And so kept her out of the courtroom until the judge walked in. And when the judge walked in, he recognized, apparently, either by divine intervention or recognized because he knew Marion and saw her in there and said, hey, the lady that's out in the foyer, she needs to come in here. So Marion walked in the courtroom. And they go through this whole proceeding concerning this girl who had violated the law. Now listen to this. You hear so many things about courtrooms and judges and our country going the wrong direction. Listen to this. That judge that day decided, this was his ruling that was mandated, hear me, mandated by the court for this girl. He mandated from the bench, slapped the gavel, that the girl must attend that church. I don't know, every Sunday. She cannot miss a Sunday. He mandated it from the bench. He mandated from the bench that she must go to life group. He mandated from the bench that she must attend Celebrate Recovery. Hear this. A judge slaps his gavel. It's a legal judicial order. He sends this girl to Living Stones. Pastor Marion was there. He sends that girl, the world sends that girl to the church. Why? Because there was something at that moment that they could slap a gavel to and say, that's credible. That's credible. You know why they're not slapping many gavels these days and doing that? Because it's not that credible. But that's what the scripture says when it starts talking about that the house of the Lord will be on top of all of the mountains and the nations will stream to it. If you and I purpose ourselves, cry out to God, Lord, may you fill us with your Spirit. May we purpose ourselves to be a credible people. It'd be amazing what God could do. Judges will slap their gavels and look at the worst of offenders and say, your only chance is there in the house of God. Those people are credible. That's where I want to be. I bet you want to be there too. Let's be there. Amen? A credible people. Is my life credible? Let's stand, shall we?